So this month is the month of Kislev. And the month of Kislev is significant in that it is the month of the revelation of the inner dimension of Torah. The month of the revelation of the inner dimension of Torah. What do I mean by the inner dimension? You know, the Zohar says that there is the body and the soul of Torah. There's the body is the halacha, the legalistic discussions, the practical, the technical, and then the soul is the spiritual concepts, the mystical ideas of souls and worlds and all these abstract concepts. Both dimensions, the inner and the external, are both essential, just like a person needs a body and a soul. But they, let me put it like this. To sell somebody on the necessity of the body of the Torah and the technical, the legalistic, it's much easier to talk about it because it's practical, it's concrete. So you talk about, behaviors like lighting Shabbos candles, putting on tefillin, giving tzedakah. Those things are easier to talk about. When it comes to the inner dimension of the Torah, the spiritual dimension, it's obviously more difficult to explain. You're talking about abstractions, you're talking about ideas, you're talking about things not only that can't be seen, but sometimes things that can't even be imagined. And yet, we know that you need to have both. You have to have the body and the soul. You have to have the practical along with the inspirational. So, the giving of the Torah, historically speaking, was in the month of Sivan. But in the Torah, it doesn't call it Sivan. Because in the Torah, it doesn't give names to months, it gives them numbers. And it refers to months by ordinal numbers from having left Egypt. The first month is the month of the Exodus. In fact, the first mitzvah prior to the Exodus was the lunar calendar. So the first month is the month of leaving Egypt, which we call Nisan. And the second month was the month of Iyar. And the third month we call Sivan. But in the Torah it calls it the third month. And it says the Torah was given in the third month. Okay. And why was the Torah given in the third month? Because basically Torah is the idea of three. And the Talmud talks about this at length, that Moses, who was the one who received the Torah for the Jewish people, he was a third-born child. And the Jewish people separated to prepare for the giving of the Torah for 3 days, and that it was in the third month, as we mentioned, in the threefold nation of Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and it was a three-part Torah, the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, and many other threes that are connected with the Torah. And the idea of three is that, to put it in philosophical terms, you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So you have an idea, you have the opposite, the contradiction, and then Torah is the big picture that has room for the contradiction. Hence, the joke that the rabbis can never agree, right? That for everything, there's another opinion. Or they tell the story about a receptionist at a shul answers the phone. There's a guy on the other end and says, "I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi." And the receptionist says, "You're looking for a what?" He says, "A one-armed rabbi." "You heard me." She says, "What's a one-armed rabbi?" He says, "Well, I'll tell you what I want a one-armed rabbi for. The one that I have right now, the rabbi I have, I ask him a question. He gives me an answer, but then a second later he says, 'But on the other hand.' So I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi." All right. But it's a joke, but every joke has a little truth. Okay, they say every truth has a little joke, but every joke has a little truth. Truth has a little joke. What's the truth here is the idea that Torah is truth, and truth is bigger than one perspective. It cannot be limited to one perspective. If it were limited to one perspective, it wouldn't be the truth. Okay, and that's what we say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, these and these are the words of the living God. Not only that both perspectives are legitimate, but more than that, in order to have a true perspective, you need both perspectives, because Torah is infinity, it's infinite. So two finite perspectives, each one alone cannot convey the truth. But then when you have a diversity of finite perspectives, and you put them together, now you have the truth. So that's why machloikis, the idea of a diversity of opinions, it's not a bug in Torah, it's a feature. And that's why Torah is connected with the idea of three. Because if it's not a paradox, it's not Jewish. Okay? If it's not a paradox, it's not Jewish. And that's why for everything we have, okay, there's another answer, there's another opinion. But that's all part of the idea that Torah is infinite truth, and that's why it combines within it a diversity of finite perspectives until you have the entire truth. So Torah is three. Torah is three. And that's why when the Torah was given, it was given in month number 3. This is something that I could elaborate upon at length, but for the purposes of this lecture, suffice, the 2-minute summary should suffice. Okay, so Torah is 3. Now, here's the thing. When is the 3rd month? And if you heard anything that I was saying, you would know Sivan is correct. But on the other hand, Kislev, very good. Because I told you, if anything Jewish, it has to be, but on the other hand. So Sivan is the 3rd month. It's not that it's not the 3rd month, but also, you know what also is the 3rd month? See, it depends how you count months. One way of counting is we count from the month of the Exodus. So we have Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, fine. But there's another way of counting. In fact, it's in some ways more of an intuitive way of counting months, which is you count from the new calendar year. So when does the new calendar, in what month does the new Jewish calendar year begin? When is Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year? Is Tishrei. So if Tishrei is 1, then Cheshvan is 2, and then Kislev is 3. So Kislev is also the 3rd month. So Kislev is also the month of Torah. The difference is Sivan is the 3rd month of the summer. Kislev is the 3rd month of the winter. What's summer and winter? Summer is when the sun is shining, when it's warm out. Winter when it's cold. Winter when the days are shorter. That's concealment. So there's revelation and there's concealment. There's the revealed Torah, what we call nigle de Torah, the revealed, and that's the stuff that's easy to understand, it's easy to relate to because it's concrete, because it's I don't want to call it, God forbid, pedestrian because it's holy, but it relates to pedestrian things, like what happens if this person's ox gores this person's cow, and so on and so forth. So that's the Torah of the summer. Then there's the Torah of the winter, the dark, hidden, concealed Torah, what we call nister, the concealed dimension of Torah. That's talking about spiritual ideas, like souls and angels and different worlds, different systems of reality. And both of them are Torah, the physical and the spiritual, the concrete and the abstract. They're legalistic and the mystical. They're both Torah. Happens to be Kislev is the month, the 3rd month of the winter, so this is the month of the giving of, or the revelation of, the inner dimension or the concealed dimension of Torah, which is also why Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th day of the month of Kislev, is Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus. It's, by the way, it's not, don't reverse the cause and effect. It's not that Kislev is the month of the revelation of Pnimius HaTorah because Yud Tes Kislev, because the 19th day, it's the opposite. It's not. Is Pesach the holiday of freedom because the Jews went out of Egypt? Or did the Jews go out of Egypt then because Pesach is the holiday of freedom? And all you have to do is know that Abraham was making matzahs centuries before the Exodus, and you can answer that question. There are certain times that have certain energies which are conducive to certain things, and then later on at certain points, historical events ensue which are in keeping with the spiritual energy of that time. So, Yud Tes Kislev, which I mentioned a few times, I didn't say what it was, other than the fact that it's the new year of Chassidus, that was the day when the Balatanya, the first Chabad Rebbe, was freed from prison. And when he was freed from prison, he was able to disseminate the teachings of Hasidism in a whole new way. So it is celebrated not just in Chabad, but way beyond Chabad, as the Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus. But what I'm telling you is the Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus is in the month of Kislev, not because of something that happened 200 years ago. Rather, something happened 200 years ago because that is the essence of Kislev. Kislev is the 3rd month of the winter months, which means the giving of the Torah in its concealed, inner, mystical form. So far, so good? Everyone following this? Okay, fine. So I wanted to give a talk about the inner dimension of the Torah, because it's Kislev. And I started thinking, well, what point do I really want to get across? What do I want people to come away with? So I'll tell you like this. Somebody once asked me, this guy wanted to learn Kabbalah. He never had learned Kabbalah, but he heard about Kabbalah. He really wanted to learn Kabbalah. So he said, let's learn Kabbalah. So I told him, if you want to learn Kabbalah, Zaya or whatever, Eitz Chaim, you want to learn Kabbalah, we can learn Kabbalah. But I would recommend Chassidus. I think you'll enjoy it more. I think it'll be more relevant to you. So he says, well, just tell me, what's the difference between Kabbalah and Chassidus? So I came up with this on the spot, but since then, I've been saying it a lot because I like it. It made sense to me at the moment. The guy happened to be an engineer. He was an engineer. So, in fact, a mechanical engineer, which, it's like an engineer's engineer. And so I said to him, do you know calculus? He said, sure, you had to learn calculus to be an engineer. I said, so Kabbalah and Chassidus is like calculus and engineering. There are mathematicians who know calculus a lot better than the engineers, but they can't build a bridge. The engineer may not know math as well as a mathematician, but he knows enough of it to build the bridge. Chassidus is the practical application of spiritual principles. And that's why I wanted to call this talk Unpacking Your Spiritual Toolkit. Because what I wanted to try to do, this is the challenge I set for myself tonight, is to convey to you some deep, mystical, spiritual ideas that come from Kabbalah and from Chassidus, and then show you their practical implementation as tools. So it's spiritual, but it's tools. It's not spiritual like just to be inspired or just to, sometimes people like to learn Pnimius HaTorah because it's like, it's almost like a high. You have like an out-of-body experience, and it's like otherworldly, and yeah. But the real purpose for which the inner dimensions of the Torah were revealed in our generation in unprecedented ways, the real purpose why that's happened is not for inspiration, it's not to get a spiritual high, it's because these are practical tools that we need for living. Okay, so anyways, that's the premise. You get the premise, more or less? Okay, fine. All right, so, yeah. Let's go through some examples here. By the way, before I tell you an example, I'll tell you a story. It's not a well-known story. I don't think it's written anywhere. I heard this story from Joseph Telushkin, who heard it from Herbert Wiener, who was I don't know if you know who he was. He wrote 9.5 Mystics, and it has a beautiful chapter there about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he was a Reform rabbi, and then he secretly became Orthodox. And then he, at his retirement party, he outed himself, and this whole congregation said, "We knew, Rabbi, we knew." So, anyways, when he was in college, he went to Hebrew University. So Herbert Wiener went to Hebrew University. When he was in Hebrew University, he took the Kabbalistic studies class of Gershon Shalom. Now, anyone who ever studied Kabbalah, especially the academic study of Kabbalah, you've heard of the name Gershon Shalom. So he was not the most, let's say, he wasn't the most traditional. I'm saying it euphemistically. Okay, he studied Kabbalah, he studied Zohar as an academic pursuit. He was the world expert in it, but he did not believe in its sanctity. Okay, but he was the world's expert, no question. Okay, so Gershon Shalom is teaching Kabbalistic studies at Hebrew University. Herbert Wiener is one of the students there, and enrolls this. I can't describe him as anything better, more aptly than some Lubavitcher gadfly who, I mean, if anyone who knows Lubavitcher mishpachology, I could tell you who was the Radatz's son. Okay, Radatz was a chassid, he came to Eretz Yisrael. At the end of his life, he lived there, I think, for a few years. But he had a son named Avram Yehuda. Avram Yehuda Chaim. Radatz's name was Chaim. So this Avram Yehuda Chaim, don't worry about all these references. Just imagine you're in Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the 50s. Gershon Shalom is teaching, and this guy, I do not know why Avram Yehuda Chaim wandered into the class, but I don't know, he maybe was auditing, but he came into the class and he did, of course, what you would expect. I told you, it was some Lubavitch or gadfly. So he started busting chops. So he comes in and he says to Gershon Shalom, he says, Herr Professor, pray tell, what is the difference between a Kabbalistic studies professor and a chassid? Because Gershon Shalom was the Kabbalistic studies professor and Avram Yehuda Chaim was the chassid. He says, what's the difference between the Kabbalistic studies professor and the chassid? So he says, I'll tell you the difference. I'll give you a mashal, give you an allegory. He says, it's the same difference between an accountant and a business owner. Okay, what does that mean? An accountant spends his whole day in numbers. And every number represents a dollar, even a penny. And he knows exactly how much of these numbers, dollars, cents, came into the company, how much went out. He knows exactly, and he knows every single day. At any moment, you're going to ask him, he knows to the penny. Okay, but at the end of the day, he closes his book, or his books, and he goes home, and he doesn't have access to any of that money. He knows exactly how much money is there, but it's not his money, so he can't spend it. Now, the business owner, he doesn't know exactly to the penny how much money came in today or went out today. Maybe he doesn't even know every week, or maybe he only knows every month, and it's not exactly to the penny or to the dollar. He knows generally if the business is doing well or not. But you know the difference? It's his money. It's his money. He can spend it. So Avram Yehuda Chaim didn't finish and explain the analogy, but what was his point? He was saying Gershon Shalom knows every single word and every single letter in the Zohar. But he knows it academically. He's like the accountant who knows to the penny, but he can't spend the money. By choice, by his own choice, because he's a Jew. I mean, Torah is his birthright just as much as any Jew. If he wanted to lay claim to it, he could. But he didn't lay claim to it. He saw it as an academic study. Whereas the chassid, what does the chassid know? Maybe he knows Pasach Eliyahu. You know why every chassid knows Pasach? Because it's in the Siddur, right? Erev Shabbos, very good. Maybe you know Kigavna. Kigavna is also Friday night in the Siddur. Maybe a couple lines here and there. Bereshum, Anusa, Demalka. That's it. I can't go any further. I don't know anymore. Okay, he knows a few lines of a few lines of Zohar. Okay, but it's his money to spend, meaning he's made a choice to live according to these Kabbalistic principles. So maybe he can't quote you Zohar line by line, but he's living according to Zohar in his day-to-day life. Okay, all right. So I want to talk about some deep concepts, Kabbalistic concepts, and then application. Okay, so here's a concept. One concept is, I thought this was a pretty basic Kabbalistic concept, that the nature of created existence is tentative, that God's existence is absolute, was, is, and will be, and that all creation is so conditional that it actually has to be regenerated every single second. So Hashem is recreating created reality at every moment, and if he would cease creating it, not only it would leave an empty space, there would be not even an empty space. In fact, not only would it cease to exist from now on, it would actually never have existed because it would lose everything, including its past. That's how conditional and tentative created existence is. It has no existence unto its own, even though it exists. Okay, I'm giving you the deep version first, so if you're like, your eyes are like glassing over. Okay, but that's the Kabbalistic concept. All right, I'll give you a practical application of this. So there was actually, this story is a story within a story. The story took place, the story that the story is in, took place in 770 Eastern Parkway, where the Lubavitcher Rebbe was Farbrengen. It was a Farbrengen, it was a Shabbos Farbrengen. It was Chof Shvat, Tovshin Lamed. And there were 1970. So there were a bunch of guests at the Shabbos Farbrengen who were from Eretz Yisrael, and they had flights back that night. So the Farbrengen was sort of like continuing, and they were getting nervous, and they were looking at the clock like, yeah, we got to get out of here, right? Okay, you know, those early winter Shabbosim, right? So they're looking at the clock, and the Rebbe noticed they're looking at the clock, and in the middle of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe addressed this issue and told the following story. He says that it was back in the 1920s, and it was the height of communist oppression against organized Judaism. And he said, I was in Leningrad, and I went into my father-in-law's apartment, the Rebbe's father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz. So he said, my father-in-law had been taking yechidus all night. Yechidus are one-on-one visitors. So these are people who come in and they pour out their hearts, and they, you know, it's heavy stuff. It's heavy stuff. So he'd been taking visitors for yechidus all night, and it was you know, the wee hours of the night, and he was, in a half an hour, he had to get a morning train to Moscow. He had a fundraising meeting in Moscow with an industrialist, with some type of capitalist, some guy who had money. And he was an international capitalist at that, not a Russian. So somebody who was going to meet in Moscow. And so they were spying on him all the time, the Frierdiker Rebbe. I mean, he was public enemy number one. Eventually he was arrested. He was arrested by them. So he knew he was always being watched. And you're talking about the stress of always being watched, the stress of he just was talking one-on-one all night to people who had been pouring out their hearts in the Yechidus meetings, the stress of you have a train to catch in a half an hour. I mean, if I have a plane to catch that day, it could, you know, knock me out. He has and look how close we are to JFK, right? You can hear. I stopped, you know, I realized I became, you know, a real five towns local when I didn't hear the planes anymore. And he's meeting with a foreign capitalist, which that itself is a crime. People were shot for far less. So all of these, let's call it stressful things. And the Rebbe says, I walked into my father-in-law's room, and he was sitting calmly at his desk, arranging some papers, like it was the middle of a regular work day. And he says, I was like taken aback by how, like you would, if you saw this person, you didn't know what he was going through in life in general, and how he had just spent this evening, and where he was going in a half an hour. You would think this is just a regular work day, a regular person, you know, the level of calm, the level of just being settled. He wasn't acting like somebody who was in an intense situation. So the Rebbe said, I was so taken aback. I asked him, Ad kedei kach, to this extent, you know, like, meaning I know that we're supposed to control ourselves. We're supposed to have our emotions under control. But to this extent, I mean, to act so calm and regular. So he said, my father-in-law told me, he says, you know, there are exactly as many days and hours and minutes and seconds in a person's life as there are, and you can't add any to that number. But what you can do is be completely present in each second. So the Rebbe told that story, and the Rebbe said, there are people right now who are not 100% present with us right now at the gathering, at the Farbrengen. Understandably, they are thinking about how they have a plane to catch in an hour and a quarter. By the way, this is, I said 1970, so this is back when you could you could catch a plane in an hour and a quarter. Right nowadays with security and everything. Okay, but you remember how it was in the good old days, right? Okay, fine. It was a little different. It was a lot different. But still, even in the 70s, an hour and a quarter to get from Crown Heights, Brooklyn to JFK, okay, it's starting to get close to the time. So the Rebbe says the fact that in an hour and a quarter they have a plane to catch, and they're thinking to themselves they still have to daven ma'ariv, they have to pray the evening prayer, and they have to go to their hosts where they've been staying, and they have to go collect their belongings, and they have to get a car to the airport. And so they're imagining all of these things. In their mind, they're imagining catching this plane at JFK. So the Rebbe says, but if they would only think about the truth that Hashem is creating the entire creation, something from nothing, at every single second, they would realize that the plane that they need to catch hasn't been created yet. It doesn't exist. And that the only thing that exists right now is right here, right now. Okay, so there's a very deep concept. Hashem is creating the world, something from nothing, every single second. But the practical application is so relevant to all of us. And you could tell people, calm down, take it easy, don't get so worked up, don't sweat the small stuff. That's fine, you could tell that to people. But can you give me an intelligent reason? Can you give me an intelligent explanation why I should allow myself to be completely in the moment? Why I shouldn't be fretting and worrying about what's happening an hour from now or a week from now or a month from now? And here comes this concept which seems so ethereal and otherworldly and so spiritual, and who needs concepts like this? It's just so lofty. And when you realize the application of the concept, you realize, hold on, this isn't a luxury, this is a necessity. That knowing this idea, if you understand how to apply it, is something that will directly increase your quality of life so that you can be a better spouse and a parent and a worker and a member of the community, and everything that you're doing in life will be enhanced if you can grasp this spiritual concept. So is it such a lofty idea? Maybe, but the application is really, really practical. Okay, I'll give you another example. We have a concept that the essence of God is not found in the heavens, in the spiritual realms, because in the spiritual realms, there's only godly revelation, but not godly essence. In the spiritual realms, the spiritual beings, such as the angels, are able to perceive God, but being finite, that means it's a subjective experience. Their experience, their perception of God, meaning it's not God's essence, it's a revelation, it's a glimmer, it's a glow. Like you see the sunlight in the room, but you're not staring into the ball of the sun. Whereas in the physical world, which is the lowest of all planes of creation, you find the essence of God. That God finds himself at home and desires to be present in the physical world. Okay, now that's a very deep concept. And you hear something like that and it's like, okay, like, what does it have to do with my life? So again, I'll attempt to give you a practical application. Hanukkah's coming up, right? Okay. So Hanukkah, we have a lot of different customs. One of the customs, and of course we have the halacha of lighting the menorah. It's not just a custom, it's actually in the code of Jewish law. But there's various different customs. One of the customs we have is we give children gifts of money. We call it gelt. And gelt is Yiddish for money. I know there's chocolate gelt, and a lot of people think of gelt as the chocolate gelt. But gelt is the gelt, the money. Okay, why is there such a concept of giving children money on Hanukkah? And the idea is like this. Remember when the Greeks came into the temple and they defiled the oil? Why did they defile the oil? Why was that important to do? And why defile it? If they had a grudge against the oil, just smash the jars or steal them and go use it for themselves, and then they could have benefit from it. But they just defiled it. They left it there But they shook it. They understood how Jewish law worked, and they defiled the oil. And what was the strategic value of that? Why did they do that? So one of the problems the Greeks had with the Jews was that Jewish people insisted in attributing spiritual characteristics to physical objects. You have something called oil, okay? Extra virgin olive oil. Send it to the lab and you can see, is it or is it not? And if it's not, you sue the company for false advertising, right? That's something you could test in a lab. They say it's extra virgin olive oil. If it is, you'll see. You can test it, right? But think about something like calling it shemen toher or shemen tomeh, that it's ritually pure or ritually impure. You send that to a lab, send it to any lab you want in the world. They will never be able to distinguish anything different physically under a microscope or any other way of examining this oil. They will never be able to say, well, this is tameh, this is tahor, this is ritually impure, this is ritually pure. It's a totally spiritual status. So the Greeks hated that. They absolutely despised that. Because in their mind, the spiritual is the spiritual, the physical is the physical, and that's it. So when it comes to physical things, so just what's wrong with physicality for physicality's sake? Go work out and have your Olympics and be in good shape. And why? For what purpose? Because it itself is a desirable thing. Right? Whereas a Jew would say, no, of course I want to be physically healthy, but it has to be for a purpose. I have to take my physicality and use it for spirituality. So if I have good physical health, then I'm going to use it to do more mitzvahs. I'm going to use it to daven. I'm going to use it to learn Torah. But no, the Greeks are like, the physical is the spiritual. Look, you want spirituality? Go be a philosopher. Go study abstraction. But don't try to put the two together. And that's why they defiled the oil, because they wanted to make that point and say, there's nothing wrong with that oil. It's perfectly good. Use it in your thing. Just go burn it. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. And the fact that Jews said, no, it's not perfectly fine, and not only it's not perfectly fine, but we're willing to fight to the death to make this point, that's like a quintessentially Jewish concept. So the Rebbe brings out something very interesting. It's a Chiddush in Rambam, that in Hilchos Hanukkah, in the Mishnah Torah, the 14-volume compendium of the entire halachic code of the oral law. So the Maimonides talks about, he gives a little history lesson of what the Greeks did, and he says, Pashto yadim b'memeinim shel Yisrael, which literally means the Greeks set forth their hand upon the Jewish possessions. The Rebbe says, why is there poetry here? It's a halacha sefer, say what you mean. They set forth their hands, they stretched forth their hands upon Jewish possessions. If they stole it, say they stole it. If they vandalized it, say they vandalized it. What it means, they set forth their hand on Jewish possessions or Jewish wealth. So the Rebbe says like this, it's similar to when they defiled the oil. They didn't take the oil, they didn't vandalize the oil, at least not physically. They defiled the oil, they gave it a touch, they touched it, they defiled it, right? So Pashto Yadam B'meinam Shel Yisrael, the Rebbe says like this, the Greeks didn't say, we're going to take your wealth. They said, we're going to leave you with your wealth, but we're going to touch it first. We're going to defile it. We're going to give it a Greek touch. We want you to assimilate. Remember, the Hellenists wanted to Hellenize. So they wanted Jews to assimilate. You know what that meant? They wanted Jews to treat physical things as physical. Real Epicureanism. I mean, that's what we use the term Epicurus, which means a heretic in Talmudic lexicon, but it really comes from Epicurus, or Epicurus. Epicurus is the cooking website, the recipe. But Epicurus was the philosopher, Epicureanism, and that was his worldview. The physical is the physical, that's it. So the Jewish worldview is no, we will not just treat physical things as physical. We will sanctify physical things. We will turn physical things into mitzvahs. And that's why, to celebrate the fact that we're here and the ancient Greeks are not, we give our children money. Money, because we take something which is, if you just take it at face value, if you don't see more deeply, if you don't see the potential of it, it's just material. Just mean those who worship money itself, that's materialism. But the Jewish view is, no. You know what you can do with that money? You know how much spiritual potential is there? You know what you could spend that money on? You know how many mitzvahs you can do with that money? So the idea that Hashem cannot ultimately be found in the spiritual worlds. Only a glimmer, only a ray, only a reflection of godliness can be found in the spiritual realms. But the essence of God is only present in the physical world. That is expressed in the idea that we cherish physicality as the most potent way to connect to God. You know, they tell a story. The Vilna Gaon was on his deathbed and he was crying. His Talmidim were asking why he's crying. You know, was he afraid of the Yom Adin? He didn't stop learning Torah. Was he afraid of judgment? They say he grabbed his talis cotton, his the four-cornered garment with the tzitzis on it, and he was holding it and he was crying. He says, I'm about to leave a world where for a few kopecks you buy one of these garments and you do a mitzvah every second you're wearing it, and I'm going to a world where for all the treasures of that world you can't do one mitzvah. By the way, mentioning the Vilna Gaon said that one who studies the soid, the secrets of the Torah, will understand Pshat, Remez, and Drush, the other levels of Torah, the concrete and the referential and the homiletical. He says, but one who does not study soid, even Pshat he will not understand. Yeah, so I think it's very important. People who follow and revere the Vilna Gaon should know that if you refuse to study the secrets, the mystical inner dimension of Torah, the Vilna Gaon himself testifies that you will not even be able to understand the most literal meaning of Torah. And it was just something to consider. So that's another deep concept, the preciousness of physicality, of mitzvahs that we do with our bodies, and that's holier than anything they do in heaven. It's holier than anything in heaven. The angels, they envy the souls who get to come down and be embodied, even with all the tests and even with all the difficulty and the distraction. But spirituality is not where it's at. That's what, the ultimate goal in Judaism. It's not heaven. We believe in heaven. The ultimate goal is not heaven. The ultimate goal is the perfection of the physical universe. And when the physical universe becomes so perfected, you know what will happen to all the souls who are in heaven? They come back down here, right? Right. That's the 13th principle of faith, the resurrection. Why would the souls come back down here? Not just Mashiach, Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection. Why will the souls come back into the physical world? Because a perfected physical world is far more godly than the highest heaven. Anyways, that's the abstract way of saying it, but the practical way of saying it is give your kids Hanukkah geld. Give them money. No joke, give them money. And make a party and make latkes, and you eat the latkes, and you make a brocha on the latkes, and then you use the calories from the latkes to go on the menorah parade, or go to the menorah lighting in the park, or just put it in suggestions, family things, bonding that you could do. And you ate extra sufganiyot and you need to burn the calories. Sometimes you can go to menorah lighting in the park, or you can go on Mivtzayim. Yeah, you go get a menorah, and yeah, you can go and find people Jewish people who don't have a menorah, and you go out and find them and give them a menorah. Okay. Tell you another deep concept. We just learned it today we have a Tanya class, a women's Tanya class on Mondays at 11 a.m. at Chabad of the Five Towns upstairs in the library. So actually, we just learned this concept today. This Kabbalistic concept from the Eitz Chaim, which is a sefer of Harav Chaim Vital. Harav Chaim Vital was the chief disciple and the scribe of the Ari Zal, of Yitzchak Luria. So Harav Chaim Vital writes that every single Jewish person, echod tzaddik ve'echod rasha, whether he's a tzaddik or a rasha, whether he's righteous or he's wicked, yesh shtei neshamas. He has two souls. He has two souls. Okay, so one soul, and today we just learned this. We learned chapter 1. We didn't learn chapter 2. So for those who are in the class, sorry for the spoiler, but I'm going to mention what it says in chapter 2. One soul is what we call the animalistic soul, and its desires for self-preservation. So comfort and pleasure, and you call it the ego. You can call it lower instincts, lower self. You can call it You can call it the carnal desire. You can call it selfishness, but it's a drive for self-preservation, self-fulfillment, self-enhancement. Okay. And then there's this other soul, and it's the exact opposite. It's an altruistic drive. It's selfless. It actually is seeking expiration. It wants to, not because it's self-destructive, God forbid, because a penchant for self-destruction is another type of selfishness. No, it's not trying to achieve self-destruction. It's trying to become one with God. So it wants to it wants to erase its separate selfhood in order to become dissolved in the oneness. Okay, so you have these two drives. One drive is self-preservation, and the other drive is the desire to become one with the all. Now that's a very lofty way of saying it. So let's translate it. Practical spiritual toolkit. I had one of my first Tanya classes. I'm talking about maybe 15 years ago. I gave a Tanya class, to a group of women who had never studied Tanya before. In fact, I don't think had studied much Torah before at all in any form. And they were not observant, not at all observant. They were very strongly Jewishly identified in a cultural way, but not observant in any traditional sense, or even in any liberal interpretation of the word. They were culturally Jewish, I should say. And they would tell you that. You know, I don't like to use the term because it sounds dismissive, but you know, what we call bagels and lox Judaism. That's what they practice, bagels and lox Judaism. So, and we were studying Tanya together, and I remember one day, it was this time of year, you know, after you set the clocks. No, it was right before, that's right. It was right before we set the clocks back. Because, this was part of the conversation. This lady comes in to the class and she says, you know, I got all excited about Shabbat candles. I'm going to light Shabbat candles on time. And I remember the class telling her, well, you know what's going to happen. They're going to set the clocks back, and then you're going to have to light at like 4:30. It's going to be crazy. And she said, don't worry, it's going to be fine. So, and this was like a real breakthrough for her. And this is not a Shabbos observant person. She wanted to start, and this actually factors into the story. She was not Shabbos observant. She took on to light Shabbos candles. After she lit candles, she did malacha, she did work. She wasn't keeping Shabbos yet, but she started to light candles, and she wanted to light them on time, which was a big deal for her, coming from, you know, having nothing like that in her background. So she comes in the next week, and she's all like kvelling, like proud. And she says, I want to share with everyone this wonderful thing that happened to me this week. She says, I looked at the clock. So this was the next week after they set the clock back. She says, I looked at the clock, and it's candle lighting time was at 4:50 something. I forget the exact, 4:50 something. And I see I have to light Shabbos candles now. She says, at that moment I'm about to light the Shabbos candles, I realize I wrote a check today. And remember checks? we used to have papers, we would write on them, sign checks. Okay. You have to show ID to prove that. Okay. Anyway, so she said, I wrote a check today, and it's not covered. And I have money, I have another check, and if I go to the bank and I deposit that check, it'll cover the check that I wrote, so it won't bounce. And I'm looking at the clock, and I'm realizing, hold on a second. The bank is closing, and if I go there right now, she says, I could go to the bank. Bank's like 5 minutes there, 5 minutes back. But if I go to the bank and I deposit the check, I don't light Shabbos candles on time. I told you she wasn't from, or she would have known about the 18 minutes. And anyways, she was too pure and innocent, Baruch Hashem. Anyways, so she says, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking to myself, can I do this? And she said, no, I can't. I can do one or the other. Either I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to make the deposit and not bounce the check, or I'm going to light Shabbos candles. I can't do both. Can't do both. So she said, I started thinking to myself, what do I really want? And she said, well, you know what? I don't know what I really want. I want both. I don't want to bounce the check, and I don't want to pay the penalties, and I don't want my husband to be disappointed. And on the other hand, I want to light Shabbos candles. I want to be part of this thing that's happening all over the world. Jewish women and girls all over the world are lighting, and I don't want to be excluded from this wonderful thing that's going on all over the world. So she says, I'm like going back and forth, and I'm trying to figure out, and it's like time is ticking, I'm trying to figure out, what do I want? What do I want to do? And she says, all of a sudden I realized, hold on a second. Every Jew has two souls. So there's one part of me, animal soul, self-preservation. It says, go deposit your check. Why should you have to pay the bank money because you were being religious, because you were lighting a candle? Go cover the check. She says, there's another part of me, godly soul. Godly soul doesn't care about that. The godly soul wants to do whatever is going to allow it to become closer to the infinite. And at this moment, what can make me closer to the infinite than anything else at this moment is to light that candle at that time. So she says, once I understood that's what we were dealing with, I said, hands down, easy decision, godly soul. So I'm telling you, this is a woman who, she wasn't from an observant background. She started studying Tanya, and this is what it brought her to, which brings me to a very important point that I would like to highlight here. A lot of people ask the question. Remember we were talking about before about the body and the soul of Torah. There's the legalistic, right? And there's the spiritual. A lot of people question, what is the value of teaching spiritual, deep spiritual concepts to people who aren't even observant? People ask that. It's a real question. People say, let somebody become observant. They'll study halacha, Jewish law. They'll start to observe Jewish law. And maybe then they'll start to study a little bit, become literate in the basics. And then after a while, we'll introduce them to more sophisticated concepts like spiritual stuff. And first of all, I'll tell you what the Vilna Gaon said. If without the sight, even the pshat, you won't understand, okay? But if that's not compelling enough for you, I can tell you by first-hand experience how many people were brought to the observance of halacha through an appreciation for the spiritual principles behind halacha. Look, I'll take any Jew how they come. If somebody comes up to me and says, I want to study halacha, and that's my entry point to Judaism and how I want to start to become observant, I'm not going to send them away. Okay, I'll slip in a little chassidus as well. But no, you want to learn halacha? We learn halacha. But somebody who's ready to hear deep spiritual ideas, do not discount that and do not think that that's just icing on the cake before you've even eaten your vegetables. It's not true. It's one Torah with two dimensions, the inner and the outer, spiritual and the more practical. And they all lead to the same thing. And in fact, many times you see somebody who learns the soul of Torah, that's how they end up with the body of it. Okay, I don't know. I made a whole list of, I have like 20 of these. I'm not going to tell you all. I didn't know how long it was. I never gave this talk before, so I'm just unpacking my spiritual toolkit. I didn't know how long it was going to take to unpack the whole thing. So I only told you, I think, 3 ideas. I'll tell you a fourth one very shortly. I'll tell you one more. And I'll do it shortly. I'll do it as briefly as possible. This is an important concept. And I'll tell it to you the abstract way, and then we'll tell it the practical way. The abstract idea is there's a notion that there's a notion that the Jewish people are actually one single entity which through embodiment takes on the appearance of separation from itself. Like, yeah. The embodiment, the fact that, two things can't be in the same place and one thing can't be in two places, embodiment is what causes the appearance of separation. So here's me, there's you. But if you look at us spiritually, we're one soul. We're one spiritual energy, the entire Jewish people. There was once a teacher teaching his class about singular and plural. And so he taught them different nouns, singular and plural. So he says, like shoes is plural. And he says shirt is singular. And he asked him, what's pants? And the kid said, plural on the bottom and singular on the top. Okay, but actually, the Jewish people are plural on the bottom, singular on the top. Down here in the physical world, we each inhabit different bodies, so we're separate from each other. Spiritually, we're one entity, we're one being. And that is the mystical concept of the oneness of the Jewish people. So that's the spiritual concept. What's the practical application? So actually, this practical application I got from the Jerusalem Talmud, from the Yerushalmi. It says over there that if a person makes a vow, there's a concept, if a person makes a vow, they have to keep the vow, but it's a mitzvah to actually be released from your vow. And the way that it's done, you have to go to a chacham, to a sage, and he finds what's called a pesach. A pesach means an opening, but what it really means is that he has to find something. Had you known this piece of information at the time of your vow, you would never have made the vow. So like, let's say somebody says, I'm making a vow never to eat dairy again. And then he goes to the chacham and he says, well, did you know ice cream is dairy? No, I thought it was just cottage cheese. I didn't realize it was. He says, well, yeah. Well, if I would have known that, I would never make such a vow. And then the chacham, the sage, can annul the vow. Okay. So the Yerushalmi tells a hypothetical scenario where a guy was noider b'hana. That means where he got so mad at some other Jew where he said, if he makes a party, I'm not going, right? If he's the honoree at the dinner, I'm not going, right? I don't like this guy. I don't want any benefit from him. Okay. So he has to keep that vow because he made a vow. You have to keep it. But like any vow, you should be released from it, especially a vow like that, which is not a nice vow. But he can't stop it on his own. He has to go to the chacham, the sage, and the sage will release him. So the Yerushalmi says like this. The sage says to the guy who just made a vow, I'm mad at so-and-so. He hurt me and, I'm getting back at him. So the sage says to him, there was once a worker in his workshop, and he was working with a sharp tool. And when he was working with his tool, he slipped. And with his dominant hand, his right hand, who was holding the tool, he slipped, he stabbed his left hand. Should his left hand then grab the tool and stab the right hand in retaliation? So when the chacham says this scenario, the person hears that and he says, well, no, of course not. That would be absurd because he stabbed himself and he should stab himself again. It's like, this is even more than two wrongs don't make a right, because two wrongs don't make a right just means nobody gains. Nobody gains. But this is more, this is deeper than that. This is one guy gets hurt twice. One guy got hurt twice. So one guy stabbed his right hand, and now to even the score, the same guy is going to stab his own left hand, so now he's hurt twice. So the chacham then says to the guy, once he has that clarity, he says, well, you know what? When this guy hurt you, that's one person The Jewish people are one person. That's one person having been hurt. Now you hurt him back. Now the same person has been hurt twice. Because the Jewish people are not a people. We're a person. We're one entity which inhabits different bodies. So this sounds like such a lofty concept, one soul and emanating into different bodies, but the practical application of it can help you get over a grudge, can help you seek forgiveness, can help you heal from emotional wounds. It's very, very practical, very practical. And I hope you'll, based on these examples that I've given you, you'll believe me. Well, don't believe me, go test it out. But you will become curious enough now to go test out that every deep spiritual concept in the mystical dimension of the Torah has practical, everyday, relevant applications. Okay.